Merlanda is here today to support the Children's Mental Health Learning Series by introducing our presenter. Merlanda is a motivated young lady who is passionate about helping youth and families understand social media and the impact it has on adolescent mental health. Through Merlanda's personal experiences, she hopes to help educate and mentor other youth with the importance of internet safety and awareness. Merlanda has aspirations to become a successful, independent woman one day. Merlanda.
Good. Okay. Good morning and welcome to the Children's Health Mental Health Learning Series. This learning series provides free, helpful information and strategies for youth, their families, caregivers, and professionals who support youth with mental health issues. Increasing information for families and caregivers for youth about a wide range of mental health topics builds our capacity to support young people in Alberta. There is hardly a topic that creates more angst and confusion for parents and professionals than the role of social media in adolescents' development. The session will explore the pervasiveness of social media in the lives of adolescents, discuss how social media is changing the way youth relate to their social world, and review the literature and the positive and negative effects of social media on adolescents' mental health. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kelly Dean Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is an associate professor in the School in Applied Child Psychology program at the University of Calgary. A registered psychologist for over 20 years, he is also a director of the University of Calgary Applied Psychological and Educational Services, UCAPS, and on-campus clinics serving children and families, Calgary and area. He has a PhD in School of Social Psychology and the Master's in Educational Psychology from the University of Calgary. His research and teaching interests include all areas of child social development, but particularly those psychosocial factors contributing to adolescent and family development. Today, Dr. Schwartz's topic is Connected or Disconnected, when media and social media affect adolescents' mental health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Dean Schwartz.
Thanks, Merlanda. Could I have given you some more, like 4 or 5 syllable words to say? That would have been really great. You did excellent. Good job. Now you have to go back to school. That's too bad. I mean, that's not too bad. That's good that you're going to school, but too bad you can't be with us. So. Well, welcome everyone. It's very good to be with you guys again. I've had the privilege of doing a couple of sessions with the ACC FCR group and the Children's Mental Health Learning Series, and really privileged to be with you this morning talking about a topic that, as I said as Merlanda said in the introduction, rarely is there a topic that causes so much discussion, confusion, angst, all those things. So what I hope to do this morning is provide a little bit of fodder for thought. And in fact, I joked with Merlanda that I wish she was staying because she, as a teenager, is probably the resident expert on social media. I'll speak for myself, but at my age, I'm more of an observer than I am even a participant observer, which is really strange for me because in most of the research that I do, which is a lot in identity development, parent-child relationships. We do some stuff on cyberbullying. I feel like I've got a good handle on that in terms of what my role is in that, both as a practitioner, as a parent, as a citizen. But when we talk about social media, I feel like we are, I feel like I am really a critical observer, looking in on some of the literature, looking in on some of the research, and then hopefully having some good discussion with you all this morning. So it's great to be with you. Amy, we have how many sites joining us this morning? Oh, yes. Great. So we have about 450 sites joining us this morning. So I'm hoping that all of you are ready to be engaged as well. And we've got a nice little group here in Calgary. Thanks for joining us this morning. So I kind of tongue-in-cheek have this next slide. Why does my head always hurt? At the end of the day, I sort of feel like some days that I've spent too much time in front of a screen, whether that's the screen in my hand, whether it's the screen that's on my wall at home called a television, or mostly whether it's that blasted screen on my desk known as my computer. And I feel like we are at that time in our culture and at that time in our social history where we are playing catch up all the time, trying to stay current with all of the sources and even the recipients of media engagement that we have in our society. And if I feel like that as a 40-something-year-old, I can still thankfully say that actually. Next year I won't be able to say 40-something. But as a 40-something-year-old, I can only imagine what it's like for a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 17-year-old as they are trying to navigate their social worlds. Because as I said, I can kind of do this and pick my spots in where I engage with social media. I feel like as children and certainly as teenagers, they may not feel that they have that luxury. And so if my head hurts at the end of the day, I'm sure theirs does as well. So we've got a very little bit of time today, and I don't pretend at all that we're going to do much more than kind of poke at some critical areas in this discussion on social media. So I've limited our discussion to 3 areas, and I'm hoping that then in the minutes that we have afterwards, anything that we don't cover, maybe we'll get at through some question and answer. So first thing I want to do is explore just the pervasiveness of social media and media in general in the lives of adolescents. I think I'm always challenged to keep up with just those stats in and of themselves, and I hope this morning I'm able to give you somewhat the most recent of those. Secondly, I want to discuss how social media is changing the way that youth relate to their social world. So, again, most of us in this room experienced adolescence differently than teenagers are experiencing it now. Would you agree with that? Yes. In fact, I would say if you have a 20-year-old in your house, they are experiencing their adolescence different than 10, 11, 12-year-olds are experiencing it now. The culture is shifting that quickly. So I want to discuss how that's changing the way that adolescents just go through that developmental period. And then lastly, I want to focus on the positive and negative aspects of social media and how it influences adolescent well-being and in some cases mental health. And I'm going to limit our discussion to, because I have the luxury this morning of not necessarily talking always in clinical terms, I want to talk specifically about 2 critical developmental areas: sense of belonging and identity development, and then how those contribute to good mental health for adolescents. Okay, does that sound like enough? Does that sound like it'll get us through? Okay, I start every session with not an obligatory nod, but a genuine nod to a virtual mentor of mine, Bronfenbrenner, who really changed the way that psychology looks at human development. Bronfenbrenner's work came out in the 60s and 70s, but really didn't get its due attention until late 70s and early 80s because it was battling against kind of the behaviorism and psychodynamic fields at that time. This is just one visual representation of Bronfenbrenner's model, but you can see from it that the key here is that the child is embedded within a series of systems, and that every one of those systems, whether it's actually touching the child or whether it is a couple degrees of separation away from the child, is very important. And you can see in this depiction that on the bottom left-hand corner there in the white circle, that media is one of those, what he called microsystems, that is in genuine and real contact with that developing child. So you can see the other microsystems that are equally as vocal and equally as connective to that child. And in some cases, you can see how those microsystems overlap. And we're going to talk a little bit about how media and social media even overlaps with, certainly with family systems and certainly with peers. But we just don't have time to go any further than that. But now again, Canadians are famous for coming in second or third or 10th, and we're very famous for smiling and just happy to be there, right? We're great participants. And when I was looking for, again, mining what I could for the most recent data on just where we sit in terms of our overall media engagement. Now, we're going to start really large, and we're going to work down to looking at children and teens in particular. I found this from a recent publication by Carew, and I hope that's coming across clearly, that comparing about 7 different nations, and on the left-hand side, just the average number of hours engaged in each of those activities per week. Now, if you go over to the right-hand column, you'll see that total average hours spent per week for Canadians is about 61 hours. So that includes internet, TV, radio, email, using your mobile device, video games, newspapers, magazines, so it's all the sources of media. Now, if you scroll across the bottom, you'll see that we don't, sadly, well, I don't know if we're sad, but we don't lead the way. We come in fourth or fifth on most of these areas. In only one area, playing video games, on the right-hand side there, do we actually lead these 7 nations in its actual hours per week engagement. Don't get hung up on all the numbers. Just kind of soak in for a minute that, most of us work, 40, 50-hour work weeks on average. Well, add to this that we add another 60 hours per week of media engagement. Now, no doubt some of this is going to overlap with our work. We're going to be online searching up articles. We're going to be connecting with colleagues. But just grasp for a moment that we're talking about another work week engaged with media. Now, this is diverging between adults and teens. This is just asking Canadians, or asking members of these nations how much they engage with this. So already we get a sense that even as adults, we are immersed in and greatly connected to our media. But when we talk about adolescence and just the advent of, like I said, how their adolescence is different from 10 years ago and is certainly different from my adolescence, I found this very helpful little timeline here from a place called Common Sense Media, and I'm going to give you their website address at the end. But they just kind of loosely just look at the additive and even multiplicative sources of media all the way from 1930s and now to the 2000s. Here's where I get into my dad rant, because I look at my bills at the end of every month, and I am paying for so much technology that my parents were. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm making probably 30 times more than my parents did at my age in my income. But my outcome, what I'm actually paying to engage with media is really stunning. And I'm every month I get mad about it. But you look at just these popular media platforms that we now, in the last 15 years or so, is different from what it was like to grow up in the 90s and different from what it was grow up in the 80s and the 70s and 60s. So again, just the actual physical hardware that we have within our grasp now is entirely different. Just another one, just to show again a 10-year span. So even let's break this down from 2000 to 2010. In fact, this comes from an old presentation that I did, and I'm going to commit a real grievous academic error. I can't remember the source for this or the citation. So, but because I had to smirk, because when I looked at that broadband, we don't even talk about broadband anymore, right? People don't. Well, maybe the tech people, broadband matters, but for the rest of us, we've gone from dial-up to broadband and to how many millibytes or megabytes per second and things like that. So, but when you look at just in that last 10 years, again, now we're talking about teenagers' connection with their media. How even in 2000, connecting wireless was that wasn't even an issue. So in 10 years, we've gone from home-based social media engagement at its infant state in 10 years to now being able to connect with anybody, anywhere in the world. In fact, I've had the privilege to travel to some world areas, and I, have been in rural townships in South Africa, 30 kilometers from anywhere, and have 5 bars of cell reception in the middle of nowhere. And I go, this is incredible. We have people around here who don't have sustenance to live, but they have access. And so when I think about how seriously teenagers are connected, I have to keep remembering that they too are adjusting to this just like we are, but they're doing so in real time. Like I said, I can kind of stand back objectively somewhat and look at this, but they are having to adapt to this as it happens and as it changes. One of the terms you'll hear me say is that teenagers are digital natives, and that was a term that was coined to describe that these are kids that know nothing other than to connect, to be able to connect. So again, I know I'm throwing tons of stats at you here. This comes from, again, the Pew Research Center. Their work just recently published in late 2014. And again, there's no other... I'm not bombarding you here with anything other than to try and get us in the sense that when we talk about adolescent social media use, it's becoming less and less an option for them. It's becoming that this is a demand on them that, again, no other generation of teenagers has had to deal with. I did highlight that third bullet there, though. 71% of teen computer users say that their computer use is most often shared with family members. So take that in for a minute. 7 out of 10 teens are saying that their computer-based engagement is on a shared family computer. We're going to come back to that because very much there's a family system component to healthy, adaptive social media use. And I'm going to come back and convict us a little bit as parents to say how controlled we are with our social media use and with our media use in general is very much a modeling aspect for our children and youth. And so keep that in mind. As I said, no longer do teens have to be stationary in their mobile use. In fact, I should have turned my phone off because it's buzzing every 45 seconds here. And I thought about torturing all the members here and actually having you put your cell phones up on the table up here just to see how antsy you get and because we are no longer, we don't have to be in a place to be in contact or to be in connection with others. Those connections now follow us, and in fact, in more cases, they seek us out. They hound us. They are trying to find us. And with teenagers again, look at that, again, third bullet. Just in 2 years, since we measured this in 2011, we've gone up 14% from 23% to 37% of smartphone use. I laugh at my dad all the time because he's a flip phone user, right? But he, that's going to be his last piece of technology probably is that flip phone. Well, that's for most of us and for most of teenagers now, smartphone use is becoming the norm. In fact, when they do the upgrade, they don't want to have anything that can't be fully networked to internet, texting, data packages. And again, 1 in 4 teens are cell-mostly internet users. So that means when we talk about school or home use of engaging with internet, 1 in 4 say I don't do that. It's all based on mobile technology. So their engagement with internet is always on the move. It's never stationary. So 1 in 4 teens are saying that. Okay, you exhausted already? Like I said, to me this is, both as a clinical psychologist and as a social developmental researcher, even as I was updating my stats for this presentation and trying to get the most recent and reliable statistics, I was already overwhelmed and exhausted by the numbers that I'm putting up here. And again, I have to keep reminding myself that these are numbers to me, but these are real kids trying to keep up with their real culture on a daily, hourly, and almost by minute basis. So if I feel overwhelmed, if I feel stressed and stretched, I can only imagine what teenagers feel. So let's define our topic here. So we've already settled that, okay, media and engagement, media and access is pervasive. It is and internationally pervasive. As I said, any of you who've traveled realize that this is not a Western phenomena. And in fact, you can go to internet cafes all over the world. You can be in some of the most remotest villages in South America and on the African continent and still have that connection. So the pervasiveness of it is somewhat overwhelming. So let's narrow this down a little bit. Let's talk now specifically about social media and what we mean by that. And again, I've as a scientist, I'm constantly on the search for or in the midst of creating a good working definition of what we mean by social media. I like Jones's definition here just because it's concise. A category of online media where people are talking, participating, sharing, and networking. Now, each one of those terms could be unpacked, and because each one of them is subtly different in its expression. We're going to talk about again social networking sites, or SNS sites. And again, even as I was writing these, in fact, you're going to see here some data that looks at trends within what platforms teenagers are most comfortable using and what is most popular to use. And in some cases, those are two different things. But when you look at what we mean by social media and then the platforms, so all the notable culprits here, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat, microblogging sites like Twitter and Tumblr, text or voice chat during multiplayer online games, which is that's a session in and of itself. Unpacking that for adolescent boys is its own social media world. So Amy, there's session number 38 we could do. And then communication within virtual worlds, so where individuals truly become participants in a virtual second life. They take on a character, they take on personalities, they take on actions, they have histories, they have futures, and they have presents. So there's that whole side of when we talk about social media. We're going to generally limit ourselves to talking about kind of the more popular mainstream social networking sites today. Now again, question we should ask and answer early on here is how deep and how wide is social media? So now we've narrowed down from media, and now we're just going to talk about social media. Again, I show you data from, again, that Common Sense Media group. This is, unfortunately, U.S. statistics, and I'm going to show you some Canadian stuff coming up here. But you can see that, again, used to be that as social scientists, if we could break things down in 5-year increments, that was good. Well, if you're talking about anything to do with media, you almost have to go within months. And in fact, years is almost too broad a span, like from 1 year to the next. But I want you to notice, look at what happened from 2011 to 2012. Facebook, constantly, a player. Look at what happened in Twitter, though, from 2011 to 2012. That's a massive market increase. And in fact, if we had 2013 and 2014 on there, we would likely see similar percentage gains, like 100% gains. And I think the most recent I've seen is about 48% of teens have a Twitter account and follow Twitter. So multiply that. Again, from a business marketing perspective, that's once in a lifetime type gains that you're going to see those. Look at Instagram. Didn't exist, or existed in its infancy in 2011. Had 11% in 2012. Now that's, I mean, you guys know, that's a major player in terms of its platform. YouTube, MySpace, look at that. Hope you didn't lock any retirement savings into MySpace, because it has a niche group now. I think it hasn't changed much from that. Well, it's about 5%, I think. It's a real niche, almost like a Rocky Horror Picture Show type of, you know, they're not giving up on their MySpace. That's their platform. Tumblr, seeing some increase. Google Plus, again, wasn't even there in 2011. So anyways, you get the sense here that as we move into, you know, now we're into the mid, 2010s here. We're at 2015. So we're now, again, some of the players fall off, some of them come in. And this is largely driven by, again, adolescent and young adult, or what Jeffrey Arnott calls emerging adult markets. These are the ones that are driving these markets. So I've said how youth have a pressure on them to stay connected, to be connected. In a strange way, they've got pressure on them to tell multi-billionaires what's the next thing, too, right? They are driving. So anybody who says that kids are following culture are not understanding social media. They are driving social media. They are driving the bus in this. Okay, so now what do we know about, we talked about kind of generally what do we know about media use. Now let's talk about what do we know about adolescent social media use. And here I'm going to focus on, it's, again, not as recent as some of the other data, but I like the data that was collected by this Knowledge Network's work that was published in 2012. They studied about 1,000 13 to 17-year-olds, which is our real, that mid-adolescence grouping. And I liked that they were one of the first to start tapping into how does this social media connect with them, not just at a usage level, but how does it really impact on their social and emotional well-being. So this is going to get us now talking about how this connects with that. So here's some key findings from this, and we're going to whip through this pretty quickly because it's more to get us thinking about this. Now, teens are avid daily users. Almost all the teens in the study, 9 out of 10 of them, have used some form of social media. So they would ask a general question, you know, in the last 30 days, have you used this? So among 13%. So used any social media, you can see that. And it gets all the way down to, again, on the bottom is used Twitter at 27%. But remember, in 2013, Twitter was just in its infancy again. But I guarantee you that more teens knew about Twitter and were using it than did adults who now use it. Like all my, you know, I'm following sports, I'm following news. That's my, if I want short snippets, that's where I'm going to. Well, in 2013, I wasn't thinking that way. Teens, again, were way ahead of that. Not surprisingly, in this survey, 68%, 7 out of 10, said Facebook is their main site. And then on the micro-relational level, 2/3 of them said that they text every day. Actually, I've got that stat wrong. It's 87%. I thought that was said 67%. So it's almost 9 out of 10 texted every day. I get this eye rolling. There's another faculty member with me here. I get eye rolling all the time with my grad students when they say, when I say, well, can I email that to you? And they're like, email? Yeah, that's great. I guess I'll fire up my email account and you can send that to, because nobody, even my grad students, that's an archaic form of common messaging, right? Not still useful for sending large documents, but they'd rather have that instantaneous, quick, fast, you know, that's what Twitter's all about, the 140 characters, keep it short, cut out all the extraneous stuff. So again, I think the genius of platforms like Twitter is it recognizes that if you're going to be used every day, you can't be cumbersome and heavy to move around. You've got to be quick. And guess what? Teens have figured that out. So they're avid daily users. We're not surprised by that at all. When this study asked these teens whether they see the media that they engage with as positively as they do, they see as many pros as they do cons. More than 1 in 4 teens say that social media makes them feel less shy and more outgoing. And you can see that if you read anything in green is more, and anything in the blue is less. So you can see that 20% compared to 4% said that it makes them feel more confident. 28% said that it makes them feel more outgoing versus 5% more less outgoing, more popular. So they see overwhelmingly more teens in this study saw their social media engagement as providing more positives than did kids who thought that it provided negatives. Now I'm really interested in the blue bars too. Clinically, I'm interested because I'm curious about for those small percentages for whom it made them feel more depressed. So 10%, that's 1 in 10 teens. We're going to come back to this. This comes back to, I think it's truly connected to sense of belonging and identity, that depression that they feel. Look at that shy one too. They feel less shy, so they feel like this gives them a platform with which they can get past that kind of temperament that they've been told since they were 3 years old. Oh, they're shy. Now, how many times I hear parents say that? Oh, they like to hang back. And so now, for the first time, they've got a platform that nobody's saying that to them. So you can imagine for a teen how this makes them feel. It's very empowering, especially for those teens who have those temperaments that are a little bit withdrawn. What about impact on relationships? Well, in this study, many teens, just over half, think that using social media has helped in their relationships with their friends. So they see this, contrary to what the news media would make us believe, they see this, over half of them see this as contributing to their relationships. Now, one of the fields of research that I'm just getting into for the last about 3 years is cyber aggression and cyberbullying. So actually looking at some of the contextual factors that, so one of the things we're looking at is what protective factors actually soften the experience of being a victim of cyberbullying. So we're looking at some of those things. But it turns out when I compare that with what this study says and what other studies say, most teens don't see their social media experience as being negative, or that they're at risk for being bullied, or that they're opening themselves to a whole new threatening world. No. Look at this. 52% versus 4% in terms of that it's helped their relationships with their friends. Now look at the next one below that. It's 37% say it's helped in their relationships with their family. Now that is very interesting. That's where you want to pull, the researcher in me wants to pull 30 people out of that study and sit them down in a room like this and say, tell me what you meant by that. How does it improve relationships? Now there's some great examples of this. There's, and again, I'll use personal examples too. When my kids are out, my son who's 16 just got his driver's license about 4 weeks ago, so you are all fairly warned. Okay. But when he's out and I say, hey, can you mind checking in when you get to wherever you're going? That's a check-in, right? Now that helps me, and maybe in some cases that helps him. He doesn't actually have to go and find a phone, embarrassingly, and say, I got to call my dad because he wanted me. No. He sends me a one-word here, send, and we're all good. Okay? So they see this as not only being a neutral form of connection with the family, they see it as a positive source of connection and a positive source of relationship development with family. I think the peer one I'm not as surprised about as I am about. Now look at that teacher one. I know we've got some teachers here this morning. It's not, you guys are not on the list for being that social media is helping in that relationship. But again, this is 2013. We're now, so the data was probably collected in 2012. We're 4 years past that almost. Now I know we've got researchers at U of C that are really engaging with social media as a source of connection between student and teacher. Here's where it gets some interesting. Again, this study asked some provocative questions. About half of all teens said that their favorite way to communicate with friends is in person. Now, again, as a social developmentalist, I'm both encouraged and a little bit disappointed by that. Because I'm encouraged because all you hear in the public media and the news media is, well, kids don't, they just rather sit home and text and chat. But no, over half of them said, no, if given the choice, they'd prefer to be face-to-face with their peers. The disappointing part of that is, it also means that almost half of them would say the opposite. They'd actually rather electronically relate with their peers than they would face-to-face. We'll talk a little bit about that. So they say, yeah, teens said face-to-face conversations are more fun, and they can understand what people really mean better in person. Boy, if there's ever an age, well, probably gender too, but an age gap, it's how bad an emailer and texter I am, because I am terrible at emoticons and putting happy faces at the end of things, and whereas teens, they have a nuance that I don't have in their online language. They're clumsy with it, and as we know, that clumsiness gets misinterpreted as aggression or an insult or a threat. So they're very, they're still novices in it. So anyways, here's the reasons why. They said among 13 to 17-year-olds whose favorite way to communicate with friends is texting, the percent who said the main reason they prefer. So look at that. Quick, easy, gives them time to think about how to respond, which I have to say, I don't actually mind either. Somebody sends me a note and I don't have to fake interest or excitement, or I can kind of give myself a few minutes or half an hour or half a day and then respond, right? I can temper so we get this, right? On a social, relational level, some of this makes a lot of sense. Okay, that's sort of the positives, and tinged with some of the drawbacks, but certainly there's some negatives, and this again comes out of this same study. A third of the teens agreed that using social media takes away time that they could be spending with people face-to-face. So they are starting to realize that this can be a hindrance to that face-to-face that they want to have. Almost half, 44%, agree that using social media often distracts them from the people they are with when they do get together in person. You want to do interesting social observation, just go to a mall on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon at about 1:30 and see kids together but not together, because they're all sitting around like this, right? They're all sitting around and they're, look at this, or, so they're there but they're not there. Again, I read this encouragingly, because I don't know that we would have got this 3 or 4 years ago, but now teens are getting how frustrating it is to be with somebody who's not really there with them because they are 10 different other places. So they get that. And that'd be interesting to see if that number is going to increase. Nearly a third say they have flirted with someone online that they wouldn't have done so in person, and 25% have said something about someone online that they wouldn't have said in person. This gets into that social psychology, that depersonalizing, anonymizing element of social media. That you say things, you act more aggressively, you act more provocatively than you would if you were standing in the same room or 6 feet away from that person. So, key for me as an educator too, that's another hat I wear, is educating kids on setting up those boundaries of what to say and when to say it and how to say it. And then doing the impossible that we've been trying to do with teenagers for 10,000 years, have them think ahead to the consequences of that, right? Or to get them to think past the moment. But I think, interestingly enough, they will learn more about that in one mistake with social media than they could in 10 hours of lessons about trying to teach consequences. So there's teachable moments here that we can use for adolescents with their social media mistakes that we couldn't have done even 5 years ago. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Same study, substantial percentage of teenagers, 41%, answered yes when asked if they were addicted to social media. Now, here's where keep flipping back to my personalities. Now the clinical side of my personality clicks in, or my profession. And I go, okay, are they really understanding what the term addicted means? Well, from a social research perspective, it doesn't matter. They think, if they're saying they're addicted, that's probably an underestimate, because if anything, adolescents in some cases tend to inflate some of their responses to survey items. So 4 out of 10 say that they are addicted. Now again, if you go back, you go to the literature and say, what's the symptoms of addiction? You know, it's essentially that withdrawal symptoms kick in, and or you get thought distraction, where when that person or that drug or that whatever is not immediately available, that's all you can think about. Well, you talk to teens and you talk about their connection, not to the people of the social media that they're connected with, but the opportunity to connect with them. That's where they say that they're addicted to it. Now, look at that underlined one. I didn't want you guys to miss that. Almost a third, at least a quarter, said their parents are also addicted to their gadgets. So that's very interesting from a family systems perspective. I went to, personal example, went to the Hitmen game last night, junior hockey game, 6,000 or 7,000 people around. And during period break, I just, was casually looking around. And kids are bouncing around, throwing popcorn and stuff. Where did I see parents? Down on their phones, right? And again, I know that's totally unrepresentative sample, but a great anecdote of how do kids see us when we're interacting with, can we put it away? Can we literally lock it off, turn it off, shut it off, get it out of our sight without feeling like we are missing something? And if we cannot, survey says kids are noticing that. They are seeing that. So again, I don't get fussy about whether or not it's a clinical level of addiction. They're seeing that this is a problem for them, and they also see it with their parents. Many wish that they could unplug, and more than a third agreed that sometimes they wish they could go back in time to when there was no Facebook. Oh, poor Mark Zuckerberg, how is he going to feed himself next month? But think about that. That's a telling statement. Because not only do you have teens identifying that they may have a problem, in some cases they wish that the platform for that problem didn't exist anymore. But that goes back to one of my first statements today, that kids are feeling this incredible pull towards this technology that is really strong. It's an undercurrent. And they feel somewhat helpless against them. Here's a direct quote. They did some qualitative stuff in this study. Sometimes it's nice to just sit back and relax with no way possible to communicate with anyone. So lesson number 1 for all of us today is give kids opportunities to do exactly that. Give them that freedom to do that. Yeah, they'll complain for 90 seconds or whatever, and they'll probably do it more for show than anything. But I think a lot of kids want to have that. They want to engage, but if we give them the opportunity to stay multi-connected, they're always going to have that heightened level of stress and heightened level of anxiety about that. A couple of other negative things from this survey. Most teen social media users agreed that they love posting photos of themselves, girls way more than boys. The whole notion of selfies has really, it's not a notion, the whole practice of selfies has become somewhat maligned now on social media. I think even teenagers are starting to see the, kind of the narcissistic part of that. But boy, do they love to see themselves and to post pictures of themselves. Almost half, though, of social media users agree that they sometimes feel left out or excluded after seeing pictures of other people together. So there's no win here, right? There's a picture of their friends, but then their first reaction is, well, I'm not there. Why wasn't I invited there? So what should be a positive can be immediately turned around to that, again, kind of self-pity. Why wasn't I there? 35% say they worry about others tagging them as unattractive. So that's a third of kids. And about 1 out of 5 say that they feel bad about themselves if nobody comments on or likes the photos they post. Again, at this point in my presentation preparation, I was like, I am so glad I wasn't a teen. I mean, so now you're worried about the kids are going to post negatively, but you're also worried about if nobody posts. And in some cases, ignoring is worse than negative responses. And in adolescence, that's probably true, just from a pure developmental perspective. I used to say that in adolescence, the whole goal of adolescence is to get through the day without embarrassing yourself, right? If you can get through, that's a good day. That's a great day, in fact. Well, here we've got multiple ways now, because you can potentially be embarrassed by somebody, responding negatively, or not responding at all. So they are in a true dilemma here. Social media presents a true dilemma to them. Size matters and matters of size. Typical teen Facebook user has about 300 friends. And again, this is all stats that you can find on Facebook. They consider large Facebook networks to be anywhere 600 and above. Now, this is again from this study in 2013. I would suspect that now they've actually had to increase that span of what considers to be large. So, teens with large Facebook networks, 600 or more frequent users, have profiles on a wider range of others. So they're not only a user here, but they've got multiple platforms on the go. More likely to be Facebook friends with teachers and coaches. That's a whole discussion on boundary issues and professional space. And more likely to be Facebook friends with people they have not met in person. So the wider that span gets, the wider that network gets, the more diffuse it gets in terms of actually knowing the people that you are friends with. And in some cases, it actually pushes the boundaries on who you should be friends with in terms of adults, others. Here's interesting. I hope this comes up online as well as it comes up here. The key is that up top, the middle blue, darker blue, teens with 100 to 150 friends. So these are what we'd call small Facebook users. So when you see that, and then on the left-hand side it says a percentage of Facebook using teens who say they have shared their, and then fill in the blank. Real name, so 89%, photo themselves, 83%, interests, goes all the way down. So you can see as you get down to, last one is personal cell phone number, now you're down to personally identifying information. Now we can actually contact you in ways other than just using kind of traditional social media. On the right-hand side is comparing that group to all Facebook users. So this is an interesting stat. So it's comparing that kind of, and you hate to say marginal Facebook user with 150 friends, but really they're the smaller users compared to all Facebook. Now, get ready. I'm going to show you now a comparison of that group with the kids who are 600 plus Facebook users. Now look at real name. Now they're always over what the all teen Facebook users numbers are. 95% post real name, 96% post a real photo of themselves. So think about that. The more pervasive user you are, the wider your social network, the less you know your Facebook friends, now the more intimate you're getting in terms of what information you're revealing. 93% put a real photo of themselves on there versus 86% of Facebook users who had 150 or less friends. So that's curious, right? You'd think it would almost go the opposite. If more people are out there that I don't know, I'm going to be maybe a little bit more careful. No, the opposite happens. they actually are more engaged, more participatory, more revealing. So that's very interesting. Now, here's another one. I pulled this out of the Pew Internet and American Life survey. This goes way back to 2006 data. And so you can, in fact, you can see here on, they use lots of cell phone, and they use terms like instant messaging or things like that, which, again, aren't very, popular these days. I want you to see, though, percentage of teens, because I wanted to grasp on that notion that if you're a heavy Facebook user, you're likely also using lots of other channels of networking. So you can see that anything with a little asterisk beside it, those are multi-channel teens, and that's a significant difference between comparing those multi-channel teens with just the rest of the sample in the study. So you can see they talk more on the cell phone, they use more instant messaging, they send more texts, and they send messages more over social networking sites. In some cases, at least twice as many and upwards of almost 3 times as much engagement. So again, intuitively you'd think if I'm a heavy Facebook user, that's going to be my main go-to. But no, heavy Facebook users are also heavy users in other areas. I'm seeing I want to get to questions here, and I want to finish in less than 10 minutes. So some of the other slides here talk about some trends that I'm not going to, again, with apologies to Mark Zuckerberg. Interesting thing is happening, though. This 2013 study was finding that Facebook use is actually plateauing and somewhat in decline. You guys, I don't know if you guys are sensing that, but it's actually declining a little bit. Okay? Twitter and Instagram, though, are waxing. They are on their way, still on their way up. And again, I've got some little testimonial quotes in here that you guys can look at later. But I find that interesting that, again, it's not like Facebook is dying, but they're having to come up with new creative ways to attract their audience as well. And then, not surprisingly, rising, very much so, even in the last 18 months, is Snapchat, which is those instantaneous 5-second messages, more like a visual conversation, so it's very quick. But again, the genius of this is that the creators realize that kids don't need or want to dwell with something for longer than seconds at a time. They put it up, it's experienced, it's gone. So that, in and of itself at the relational level, is very curious. Okay, so we've done a lot here. Talked about how social media use is a fabric. It's not the great cause of angst or tumult that we think it is. In fact, most teens see it as positive. It can be a source of encouragement and support. Teens still want the face-to-face. Little bit of rise in Facebook fatigue. Lots of stuff that we haven't talked about. Privacy, bullying, hate speech, body image issues, oversharing, that sort of stuff. 4 in 10 say they're addicted, however they're defining addicted. And then heavy social media users are more likely to expose themselves because their networks become less personal. Okay. Last 2 things I want to talk about. As I said to you, I wanted this session to be about mental health, but I wanted to step away from the more clinical side and talk about the more developmental sides of mental health. And I found a couple of articles here that really talk nicely about 2 areas, and we'll finish with this, and then we'll get to some discussion. One is this notion of sense of belonging. This goes back to a colleague of mine in social psychology, Baumeister, who wrote an article in 1995 talking about that we all have basic needs, and one of those needs is this need to belong. Well, if ever there was a experience that was geared towards supporting and fulfilling that need to belong, it seems like social media could have that potential. D'Amato, however, who does lots of work in family systems theory, suggests, however, that social media can also contribute to what he calls cyber ostracism, suggesting that being excluded, rejected, or ignored can be as hurtful online as it can be in offline relationships. And in fact, sadly, we've got some, graphic national examples of kids who reacted as harshly as you can, either attempting or committing suicide based on that cyber ostracism. To the point where, again, the hate-filled messages that they received from strangers actually hurt more than whatever messages they're receiving from the kids and peers right around them. So again, being denied access to Facebook groups, defriending or blocking profile views, again, that's all a new way for us to be hurt and to, again, threaten that sense of belonging. I belong to two social, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on a thing called LinkedIn, which is what my kids call boring Facebook, because nothing exciting happens on LinkedIn. But it's interesting how, even every month I get a LinkedIn request, and I'm kind of like, well, I don't know this person. I don't know that I want them to, I don't know if I want them in here. And I'm just like, like I said, I'm a 40-something person making this decision, and I can do that somewhat benignly, But I can only imagine as a kid getting those requests or being denied, and how that really threatens that sense of belonging. It really, so even though these are, that you're still probably going to, or likely to see that kid in school or on the field or at the mall that's asking you to be a friend, or that you've asked to be a friend, you're still going to have that connection. There's still something that is unique about the social networking part of it that I feel like we're just starting to understand from a psychological perspective. Margalit asked, I like this question, does social media enhance social connectedness, provide training in social relatedness, or contribute to growing alienation or social exclusion? That's a heavy. That's a few dissertation-wide questions. I think the point they're trying to get at is that adolescents can often get caught between the need to feel a sense of connectedness and a yearning to create their own sense of identity and individuality. That is a real distinct tension that kids have felt for centuries and decades, right? Want to feel connected, but also want to establish identity. But when your identity is as closely linked to that social connection as it is in social media, this is where the two really start to tangle with each other. Bonetti says that supporting the social compensation hypothesis, they found that lonely teens, age 10 to 16, were more likely to use online chat forums to discuss personal topics. So now this is again one of those things where you go, okay, maybe this is helpful. Lonely teens have a place, outlet, source of connection. Laghi found the same for shy students, and another study found the same for students with a learning disability or learning disorder. Though, for kids with a learning disorder, if they only conversed with people they met online, it actually increased their loneliness. So for those of us in education who work with kids with special needs and learning disabilities, if their only social connection is through online means, it actually increases their loneliness. Again, that's message number 7 to us today. If we've got kids that, have those special needs, we need to be creating opportunities for them to have that real face-to-face connection, because social media is not going to suffice for that. Interestingly, for lonely teens, again, now we don't know the details on whether they had or didn't have other issues, but so that sense of belonging is critical. That sense of belonging to some. The other one I wanted to just look at real quickly is this notion of identity development. Again, I've done some work on this for the last 10 or 12 years. And we know that this concept of social identification or social identity gratification is so important to teens. You and I do this all the time too. We're constantly looking for affirmations that what other people think of us matches what we think of ourselves. And we try to make that match as closely as we can. So the ease with which this information is shared can play a protective role in helping adolescents understand what it means to be me, or what Davis calls self-concept clarity. Now add to this social networking and social media sites. Social networking exposes private information to a semi-permanent record of actions and attitudes. Now this can really contribute to what one author calls a negative cascade, meaning it's that boulder rolling down the hill. If something negative happens in social media, it is so difficult to stop that from going. And again, if your identity development is heavily invested in the social connections and the means by which you connect with teens on social media, this can be an issue. Again, given that brains are still developing, Torhada found that over 40% of teens indicated they shared sexual desires, lewd photographs, or provocative videos of themselves. So that matches the stats we saw earlier on. So that kids' desire to, again, socially connect but also establish identity is really pushed. So they throw something provocative out there, literally to see how somebody's going to bite. But the issue is it's semi-permanent. It's not like me wearing a bad pair of pants to school one day, because then the next day I can just not wear those pants. No. If I do that online, those pants are out there every day, all day, 24/7. You know what I mean? You can't get away from it. It's really that potentially damaging. Okay, let's wrap this up. Now, I know we didn't, like I said, the mental health part of this is really where I feel like, I stayed away from using the clinical language, the depressions, the anxieties, the panics, because I think those are the expressions of some of these root issues that we talked about here in terms of sense of belonging and identity development. And we're really only beginning to understand this. I'll say this for myself as a social scientist. The more I know about it, I truly feel like the less I know about it, because we'll answer one question and all it does is cause us to ask 10 more questions that we don't have an answer to. I go back to one of my favorite social psychologist writer, Kenneth Gergen, who wrote a book in the early 90s called The Saturated Self. And this is obviously 30 years before we had anything like what we have now. But he kind of prognosticated that we could enter into an era where he called, instead of schizophrenia, we call it multiphrenia. The condition largely attributed to technologies that increase social contact of being simultaneously drawn into multiple and conflicting directions. That's a $10 definition of adolescence, right? Being pulled in these multiple directions, of which social media helps, but it also hinders. And then he talks about this saturated self with other, meaning no longer are we able to develop a consistent, healthy, solid definition of self, but as a result of this multiphrenia, now we only define ourselves as a self with other. We don't see ourselves as unique or separate or autonomous. We move with that crowd. So let's leave it there, Amy. I'll leave you with a couple of resources that I really think are very helpful. Like I said, there's that Common Sense Media. There is the Pew Trust Internet Research, which again, sadly, is US based, but I like the fact that they are constantly adding to the data set. They're not a one-off, one study. Kaiser Family Foundation, if you want to look at family systems material related to media and family engagement, really some excellent studies there. And then lastly, for those of us in education, I direct you to Teen Mental Health. This is the material produced by Dr. Stan Kuchar at Dalhousie University. And he's doing a lot of stuff on school-based mental health here in Calgary and area and across the country. Their website is second to none in terms of a resource for looking at teen mental health issues that, again, might be loosely related to the topic that we've got today. Okay. I got a couple of questions, but let's turn this over to Amy and to the room and to the online group, and let's see where we go from here. Thanks, you guys, for being attentive and keeping your phones away. You guys did really well. Did very well.
All right. I got some questions. Ernie asks, are there any studies indicating how social media engagement of teenagers translates into social resilience?
Okay, that's a great question. the heavy word there is that resilience part, in the sense that I think what he's meaning is, does it contribute at all to giving kids, increasing their coping abilities and their abilities to withstand, social or other pressures? I think some of the stuff that I talked about in terms of that research that we spend a lot of time wading in suggests that, yeah, for some teens, especially that one study that talked about how for lonely kids it can actually provide a sense of encouragement, support, and confidence, then yeah, I would say that there is some research coming out that suggests that. And in fact, if you look at some of the Kaiser family research, they suggest that, again, the family connection piece is really interesting. Even though some family, and in fact, here's an example, another area that I'm just getting into is military family research. Well, we know that social media, connecting families that are separated, for months, years at a time, incredibly impacts on that child's resilience and being able to cope while mom or dad is away for long periods of time. So my answer is, yeah, there's some research coming out to that, and I would point them to one of those websites that I posted there.
Next question is from Kayla. Do the skills and feelings of confidence, being more outgoing and more sympathetic to others, get translated to real-life situations? Are there studies about the transfer of skills?
Good. That's a great question. Because that's one that I'm always interested in, because it's one thing to see a study that talks about that kids feel less shy, they feel more confident, and another thing to say, well, does it actually lead to, and I would say the answer to that question in particular is, I don't know that we have good data that's going to support that says, no, this translates. Here's where I would say, though, that there is, in fact, I go to my colleagues in the area that do work in the area of autism spectrum. They're using social media, because a lot of kids that are on the spectrum are heavy users of social media because it has that social connectedness without the face-to-face. They're now translating that into social skills development and face-to-face development. So I would say, yeah, within the next 1.5 to 2 years, we're going to see some studies trickling out that actually connects perception of increased confidence and ability and actually playing it out in real life. So, and I would point the viewer to that research to actually watch for that. Yeah.
Lanai asks, oh, and by the way, if anyone in the room has
questions,
anybody
in the room too. Yep.
Let me know. Lanai asks, what guidance do you have for parents and usage for their kids and youth? In my experience, removal of electronics has become the #1 consequence. Thoughts?
Yes. So that's a great, here I keep referring back, that Common Sense Media group has a lot of parent tip pages on it. So I would refer the viewer to that. The thing I would say outside of that is, I come back to that 40%, or sorry, that 28% of kids who feel like their parents are addicted to their gadgets and to their media, to say one of the best ways that we can help our kids manage their social media and media engagement is managing our own and putting boundaries around it and following those boundaries. I heard one speaker a couple weeks ago say, they've instituted a tech box. When they come into the house, everybody's technology goes into that box. So literally, it's a box. It goes in, meal times, whatever, that box stays with all the technology in it. And then with some degrees of permission and user responsibility, it can be used throughout the evening, but there's some real boundaries around that. In case nobody asked about this, Amy, I'm going to add on one thing. There was an interesting article that came out in the Walrus magazine just this month, talking about kids' sleep behaviors. And interesting how they didn't go into it as much as I thought they could have or should have, but how technology before bedtime is actually really heavily influencing kids' sleep patterns. And in fact, it's influencing adult sleep patterns. And if my wife was watching this right now, she'd be saying, okay, there's a guy who should follow his own directions. But studies now saying screen time before bedtime really decreases sleep. And so one of the, in answer to the question about what's good resources, one of the things we can do is, that hour before all of us goes to bed, kids included and parents, is that we put technology away and we allow that space to happen between that and the other, the only other part of our lives that is important as being awake is sleep. And in fact, in some cases, sleep is more important. And teens and children are suffering from lack of sleep. And so the more we can put boundaries around that, right around our sleep times, I think the better too. That's my little anecdotal note on that.
There's also data directly, sorry.
Yeah, grab that.
So I was just going to add, there's also data directly that says that one of the biggest problems with teens, particularly younger teens, is they leave their phone on at the bedside all night. And so even if they're not actually waking up
Exactly.
at 3 in the morning to respond, the
Yep.
number of chimes and bells and whistles that are degrading the quality of sleep that they're getting is over
That's
the
right.
top. So if you do like a sleep lab overview of the kind of sleep they're
Yep.
getting at night, it further degrades the fact that they're already getting less than they need.
Exactly. So not only is it within reach, it's actually on and active. Those are two different things, but one was even more, distressing than the other. Yep.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask my own personal question during one of these webcasts.
Sure.
So my daughter attends an elementary school, and the big debate at the Parent Advisory Council was, should the kids be allowed to bring their cell phones, their smartphones, to school, and should they be allowed to use them during their lunch hour and in the playground? And there was much discussion, but what is your professional opinion on smartphones in the elementary school setting? Because I don't
Yeah,
think we have much
elementary.
choice in high school.
Yeah. So the question you really raise is as much about kids' right as also parents wanting to have contact with their kids during the school day. So it's not only kids wanting to have technology. I don't know if you've experienced this at your elementary school, but parents also wanting to have contact with their kids during the elementary school day. So I would say that in my opinion, there's needs for it in some cases of safety and or family emergency. But I would suggest that if a child or a classroom or a school feels like they need to give permission to this, they really ought to have very clear boundaries around when and where. So if you ask me, should kids be walking around at recess or at lunchtime with phones? I would say absolutely not. Because that goes back to the case about those kids that are now realizing that even when they're with their friends, they're not with their friends because everybody's got their head down and they're doing... So I would say, no, if you need to have a cell phone at school, it's in the teacher's desk or it's somewhere that you can have access to it, but it only happens based on as needed. But to have it free roaming in elementary, I can't think of the positives that could come from that. Because again, as a social developmentalist, I want those kids playing and fighting and solving problems and being empathetic to each other and hurting each other and saying sorry. And you know what I mean? I want real life to be happening, and that just doesn't happen when you're carrying a $300 piece of equipment around with you.
So I'm going to edit that response and play it at my next Parent Advisory
That's good.
Council meeting.
That's good.
The next question comes from Kitty. She's wondering, how does social media and instant messaging, how does it relate to the growth of substance abuse among teens?
Boy, I'm trying to think if I know any. The question we always ask as researchers is when do variables cause one another and when are they correlated with one another? I'm not aware of any research that says social media, even heavy use addiction, causes any other addictive or abusive behaviors. My sense, and I'm reaching here, but my sense is that we know that kids that are stressed and deal with anxiety issues tend to self-medicate, just like adults do. So it can turn into a substance issue, but whether or not you could draw even a dotted line between, social media use, the stress and anxiety that causes, and then whether or not that leads to increased substance use or even abuse, I'm not sure. All we know, I know that second part though, kids that have mood and anxiety issues that go undiagnosed and untreated, find ways to medicate themselves, especially as they get into later adolescence. So what we might look at as a binge drinking problem with a teen could actually be a maladaptive coping technique that they're doing to deal with some of their mental health issues.
So unless I have any questions from or comments from the in-person audience, here's the last question. Can social media impact personality in terms of dual personality? Like, for example, an online personality and a real-life personality. And can that contribute to some type of personality or mental health issue?
Yeah. So that goes almost back to one of my first slides talking about the example I would use that where there might be a correlation there is in that virtual gaming world where individuals really take on separate they become that character in their game. I know that, I don't know if you remember way back when I showed you that national media comparison. In China in particular, they are having to set up detox hospitals, not just detox clinics, but hospitals, because individuals, and by individuals mostly university age, kids are getting so hyper engaged in their online gaming and in the personalities that they take on there, they are literally having mental health breakdowns. Now, whether it's leading to split personalities or multiple personalities, I can't say that. All I know is it's causing as many problems for that culture and that nation as any other mental health issue that they've seen in the past 30 years. So that's an example of one. I don't know that that translates over into other areas, but that's certainly one that is prominent in the gaming culture for sure. Yep. All right.
Wait, don't go.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. So for those of you who are unaware, this is actually Dr. Schwartz's third presentation in this series, and the evaluation responses have been phenomenal. Everyone has really appreciated everything that you've done, so thank you
Great.
again on
Thanks for
behalf
having me.
of the Children's Mental Health Learning Series. If you've missed any of these sessions, they can actually be viewed at humanservices.alberta.ca/CMH. Don't worry about writing it down. I will actually email it to you when I send you the link to the evaluation form, which, by the way, is connected to receiving a certificate of attendance. So if you want a certificate of attendance, got to give me that evaluation response. And so I'll be sending that out early tomorrow morning. Please forgive me. It's just a matter of traveling and getting back to the office. So our next session is with Dr. Michael True. He will be live from Red Deer on Tuesday, May 5th from 9:15 to 10:45 a.m. and he's focusing on prevention, intervention, and postvention of suicide. And you can still register for that session. And again, a link to the registration to that session as well as the evaluation form will be emailed to you by tomorrow. So thank you very much for coming out and watching via webcast, and we look forward to seeing you on May 5th. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.